and follow me. Now for us in the West, in general levels of calm, we're not likely to be attacked as we leave here for being a Christian. But for us here, I think that means at least two things. I think that life of faith is about a life of sacrifice of our time and our money. I think for us in the West, they are probably our two most precious resources, our time and our money. So to live the life of faith, to live following Jesus as one of his disciples, is to be willing to put our time and our money in Jesus' hands and to say, Jesus, you build your church. Use my resources that you've given me to build your church. That's the very least I think it means to live sacrificially for Jesus. But what's going to inspire you? What's going to motivate you to live that costly life? There's got to be something. Why would you sacrifice your time and your money for nothing? What's that motivation? What's that reason? I think for many of us, it's seeing the example of other Christians through history or through different places in the world who've lived that life. They inspire us. We've seen how tough they've had it and how they've committed to Jesus, and we go, there's an essence of wanting to imitate them. One such individual was called Toyohiko Kagawa. Toyohiko Kagawa. He was born in Kobe in Japan in 1880. He was born to a wealthy family. At 21, he'd finished Bible college in Kobe and taken the few possessions that he had with him and went and lived in one of the poorest slums in Japan. He lived off 2 bowls of rice a day, and he wore the same suit for several years. While he was there, he would try and help the most marginalized in society. He'd provide medicines for those really on the edges. He'd be visiting the sick, comforting those with sorrows. What motivated him to do that? Well, let me quote him for you so we can hear. In his own words, he says, "To me, born a child of sin, this redemptive love fills and thrills every fibre of my being. The cross exhibits both God's love for us and the measure of love we should show others." Do you hear that? What's the motivation for costly Christ-like living? It's the redemptive love of God. It's the cross, seeing the price that Jesus has paid for us on the cross to redeem us, to buy us our freedom, and says, well, I can't help but now live in light of that love. And as we come to Ruth, to our final talk on Ruth in chapters 3 and 4, there is a definite sense that our main human characters, Ruth, Naomi and Boaz, are all doing that. They're all living with the redemptive love of God in their hearts, and it's motivating them to live that life of faith. So what I want you to start with is on those post-it notes that are hopefully on your seats, rather than just writing one word this week, last week it was kindness, I want you to write 2 words. I want you to write the word redemption. And the second word is faith. Redemption and faith. Because they're going to be our 2 main ideas as we walk through the wonderful story of Ruth. We're going to see a daring plan of redemption to start with, a costly plan of redemption, and then we're going to see people who imitate that redemptive love. So let's start with a daring plan of redemption. And we're going to look here from beginning of chapter 3 at Naomi. So look at chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, if you would. And there we can see Naomi's objective. Why do this daring plan of redemption? Well, verses 1 and 2, she wants to find rest for her daughter-in-law, Ruth. That rest, that future, she wants someone to provide, to protect them. And it's exactly what Naomi prayed back in chapter 1, verse 9. You remember there that it was the kind of the climax of the misery in Moab. Death was all around. And as she begins leaving for Bethlehem, she prays for her two daughters-in-law, for Ruth and for Orpah. And she says, may you find rest. May you find a husband who will provide and protect for you. So with that prayer in mind from the end of chapter 1, here we now have Naomi in her daring plan of redemption, wanting to seek rest for Ruth and for herself. Well, verses 3 to 5 of chapter 3, we see the plot, Naomi's plot of redemption. It's a risky plan. She tells Ruth to kind of get rid of those widow clothes that she's wearing and dress like a bride. And she's to go to the threshing floor, to the kind of the place where the harvesters would hang out. And she's to go there under the cover of darkness, after midnight, once Boaz has had his kind of socializing for the night. And she's to go uncover the cover over his feet and lie down next to his feet. That's the plot that Naomi has for Ruth. It's daring, it's risky. And it's risky for two reasons. One, as we see time and time again, this is the days of the judges. What are the days of the judges like? Well, just look back a page in your Bibles to that final verse of Judges. In those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone looked after number one. And you can imagine a young lady on a threshing floor. She could be taken advantage of. It was risky. But Naomi trusted in the character of the Redeemer. She trusted Boaz's character. She'd got evidence that here was a man of standing. As it said in chapter 2, verse 1, here is an honourable man who will not take advantage of Ruth. Naomi has seen firsthand the grain that comes back each time Ruth seems to meet Boaz as a way of saying, here is a man who is honourable. But there was a second risk as well. You see, Naomi knew what Boaz knew, which we see in chapter 3, verse 12, that Boaz wasn't obliged to be the Redeemer. There was no law that said Boaz has to be the guardian Redeemer, because as Boaz says, there's a family man closer to Elimelech's family. There's another guy who does have a legal obligation to marry and to redeem Ruth and Naomi, but it's not Boaz. And Naomi knows that. But I think she knows the character of Boaz and is hoping that he'll be the Redeemer for them. And I think it's because of this lack of obligation that's the kind of undercurrent through the chapter. You notice it's all taking place at night under the cover of darkness. And there's a secrecy in the conversations between Ruth and to Boaz. And it's all so that if Boaz wants a way out, if Boaz refuses to do what he's not obliged to do, no one's going to get embarrassed here. Ruth can go back dignity intact. Boaz can carry on dignity intact. So that's the risky plot. And then in verse 7 to 8, Ruth executes the redemptive plot. It's an intimate scene, isn't it? Maybe you can imagine Ruth tiptoeing around in the dark, finding Boaz. It's obviously so dark they're not even known as Ruth and Boaz here. It's just a man and a woman. And Ruth would gently uncover his feet. Maybe like a caring parent would uncover the duvet cover of their child in the morning. And she just goes and lies at his feet. I wonder what Boaz thought. But then we don't need to inquire too much, because we're told there in verse 9, he awakes, startled. Who is this? He probably thinks it's a thief coming to steal some of the barley. But the great surprise when Ruth says, no, it's not a thief, it's your servant, Ruth. Well, if that was a surprise, I don't think that's a measure on the surprise that would follow when Ruth then says that bold question. Or statement, sorry. Boaz, I want you to put your wings over us. I want you to marry me, Boaz, is what Ruth is saying. But it's marvellously deeper than that. It's not in a kind of a 21st century Western style of marriage where it's, until I'm bored, then we'll depart. No, this is protect me. This is cover me with your wings. This is look after me from this day, and Naomi, until death do us part. Be our Redeemer. But it's even more marvellous than that. Because if you look back at chapter 2 and verse 12, you'll see that those same words, spread your wings over me, is exactly what Boaz has prayed already for Ruth. May the Lord bless you, he said back in chapter 2. May he cover you with his wings. May you find redemption in the Lord. So what's Ruth saying? She's giving Boaz a nudge and saying, look, you could be the one to answer your own prayers. You can be our Redeemer. You can be the one that God sends to rescue us. Well, if this was some Netflix box set, what would now take place is that the camera would shift. We'd be left with that cliffhanger and the music playing, but then we'd go back to Naomi's house. I wonder what we'd see if the cameras went there. Possibly, Naomi is sleeping. After all, this is gone midnight. But I just wonder whether she was up praying that night. Lord, would your will be that Ruth and Boaz meet and that they connect and that he'd be our Redeemer? I know your word says that you'll provide a Redeemer, Lord. Lord, I pray in faith that it might be Boaz. We can ask her when we get to heaven what she was doing that night. And then, of course, if this was the box set, the credits would then roll, wouldn't it? And we'd have to wait another week to come back with the cliffhanger. What did Boaz say? No, I'm not going to keep you waiting for another week. Look at verse 12 of chapter 3. We see it, don't we? We see Boaz's answer. 3 verse 11, sorry. He says, I will be your Redeemer, but... And like any good movie or any good box set that we've got so used to, there's a stumbling block that has to be overcome. What's the stumbling block? Well, there's another Redeemer who's closer to Elimelech and has first right of refusal. Now, I don't know if Ruth knew that already, but that's what Boaz says, isn't it? There's someone else first in line. And we await the outcome. Boaz, a man of honor, says, look, I'll try and sort it in the morning. If he'll redeem you, all well and good. If not, then I will. But we've still got something of a suspense, haven't we? So there's this daring plan of redemption, plotted by Naomi, executed by Ruth, but awaiting fulfillment. Well, let's come into chapter 4. And here what I want to see is us to see is a costly plan of redemption achieved. A costly plan of redemption achieved. In chapter 4, our language all changes. We've gone from that intimacy of lying down that's repeated often in chapter 3 to now a formal kind of business style language of sitting down. You'll notice we've moved from the threshing floor to the town gate. This is the place where all the kind of the business dealings, the legal transactions take place. And look at verses 1 and 2 of chapter 4. It's another of those wonderful God incidences, isn't it? One of those moments of providence. It just so happened. Who should walk through the gate at just the time when Boaz arrives? Would you believe it? Anybody think God had plotted this? Here is the first in line. Here's the guardian redeemer with first refusal who just so happens to arrive at this time. And so Boaz explains the situation. Naomi's land that she's got has come up for redemption. And you, Mr. Nameless Redeemer, you're the first in line here. Would you like to buy it? And we're on our tiptoes going, say no, say no, say no. But he says, you know what, I will. And we go, no, it's the wrong answer. But how wise is Boaz? He said, by the way, there's Ruth as well. And Naomi, they're involved in this package as well. You can't have one without the other. At which point he gets cold feet and we all go, yes. He realized his bank balance is going to go down if he takes on Ruth and Naomi. You know, the children that they will bear, well, some of his money has to go down there, and he's not up for that. He's not up for being a costly redeemer. He's not up for being a sacrificial redeemer. Now, at this point in the Old Testament law, when we see this, if you want to look it up in Deuteronomy 25, the normal protocol would be that Ruth should come along at that point, go up to the Nameless Redeemer, take off his sandal and spit in his face. It's an act of public humiliation. Here is a man, a Nameless Redeemer, who is refusing to do what the law of God says he should do. But then Ruth would remain single, widowed, without a future. So how wonderful it is that Boaz turns the curse of the law into a blessing by saying, fine, I will redeem Ruth. And then the removal of the sandal simply comes that kind of legal transaction. You know, like we'd do a gentleman's handshake today, or we'd get the paper out and sign our life on a contract. Boaz, as the costly redeemer, is turning curse into blessing. And again, remember, there's no obligation here. Boaz has no legal obligation to do what he's doing. It is simply an act of grace. Costly, sacrificial giving. Well, how do the townsfolk respond? Well, we see there in chapter 4, verse 11. They're delighted, aren't they? The crowd that was there in chapter 1 when Naomi walked back into Bethlehem that gasped at how shocking she looked has now been replaced with this crowd here at the end of the book going, praise be to God. Fantastic. Boaz and Ruth can be together. And may you be blessed. May the Lord bless you richly with great fruit from your womb. May you be like the house of Israel that was built up through Leah and Rachel. It's a great story, isn't it? Well, I want us to see two big implications from these two chapters. And first of all, I want us to see that Boaz is a picture of a greater Redeemer, Jesus. Boaz is a picture of a greater Redeemer who we know as Jesus. And I want us to come forward, if you will, to the book of 1 Peter in the New Testament for this. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 18 to 19. And we'll see this same redeeming language that we've seen in the book of Ruth here in Peter's letter. He's writing to a church of mixed Jew, Gentile, so very similar to us today. What is it that that Peter says has redeemed us from our empty way of life there in verse 18? There in verse 19, the precious blood of Jesus. what's saved us, what's rescued us from a life that gloried in sin, an empty life, a futile life, a worthless life, a life in league with the devil, a life opposed to God. What's rescued us from that? The cross of Christ. The sacrificial love of Redeemer Jesus. I don't know if it's still out there. It certainly was a number of years ago. The MasterCard advert. It was a very touching advert. They'd show a picture perhaps of a family enjoying family life together. And then they'd have their slogan, some things money can't buy, i.e. this family scene. But for everything else, there's MasterCard. Now we can begin to think like that with our redemption. That we can begin to offer something. Think back to the all-age talk with Thomas, how proud he was to start with. God would want me in his family. Why wouldn't he want such a gifted musician as myself? I'm going to aid the cause of the gospel if you have me. And we start thinking we can negotiate with God. We can wave our MasterCard and put it on our contactless payments and go, yep, all sorted. But we can't. All we can bring to the table is our sin and our rebellion. Only the precious blood of Jesus poured out on the cross can redeem us. That's the only thing that can rescue us. If you think you can add anything, just forget it now. So he redeems us from that empty way of life, and like Boaz provided a future for Ruth and for Naomi, so Christ provides a future for us. Look back at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. If we're a follower of the Redeemer Jesus, if we've been redeemed and rescued, we have a great inheritance. We're not told exactly what it is. We're just given signposts in this life. But we know that it's in heaven, what Peter says. It's kept in heaven for you. And unlike the piece of land that was the inheritance for Ruth and for Naomi that will perish or spoil or fade, we're told our inheritance, our full salvation will not perish, it will not fade. Nothing can spoil it. Nothing will cause it to rot. Friends, we have a glorious inheritance because of the precious blood of Jesus. Doesn't that thrill your hearts? Just pause for a moment and just reflect on the thrill of that love. But maybe if you know your Old Testament and you know Deuteronomy chapter 25 and this whole thing about redemption, you'll go, hang on, there's a problem here. Because the Redeemer had to be a brother of the deceased. And you're going, hang on, okay, so I get the redemption then and I'm trying to work it out, but Jesus isn't my brother. He's the Son of God. But come with me to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17. And magnificently, I want you to see how Jesus is described here. Hebrews chapter 2 verse 17. Jesus had to be made like his brothers. And if we haven't already got it, chapter 2 verse 11. Jesus is our elder brother. He's our elder brother who had to be made like us in every way, except without sin. Why? Well, Hebrews carries on. So that he could be our great high priest. Okay, it's changing the metaphor from redemption to priest, but it's the same thing. What's the sacrifice that Jesus offered? Himself. The priest is the sacrifice. Jesus, our elder brother, has done absolutely everything to secure our redemption and our inheritance. It's magnificent, isn't it? How there in the Old Testament, in the times of the judges, we see a picture of a great Redeemer, our elder brother, Jesus. But then secondly, the second main word that I got you to write down on your sheet was faith, wasn't it? And in the three characters we see in the story of Ruth, there's a definite element of us needing to imitate these people who lived by faith. So let's come back to the story of Ruth, if you would, in chapter 3 and verse 11. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 11. Look how Boaz describes Ruth. He says, "You are a noble character, a noble lady. And actually, all the people of Bethlehem know you as this." Not the Moabite, not the foreigner who's just hanging off the arm of Naomi, but you, Ruth, are a noble woman. And think through what Boaz has seen to make that statement. Well, he's already seen that she's come under the wings of God, that a foreigner has come into the people of God and been saved. And then, of course, he's seen her faith in action in the way that she has cared for Naomi. His generosity, his provision, his not taking advantage of her. Boaz has seen her hard work on the threshing floor day after day to provide for Naomi. It's almost as if when our writer of Ruth writes that she's a noble woman, he has in mind the noble wife and noble mother of Proverbs 31. And actually, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew Old Testament, the order is a bit different to ours. And the book of Proverbs comes immediately before the book of Ruth. So you read the wonderful woman of Proverbs 31 and you go, wow, I wonder what that would be like. And you step into the next book, Ruth, and you go, I've got it. I see what a noble woman looks like. Come with me to verse 25 and 26 of Proverbs chapter 31. And just put Ruth where it says she. If you've got a church Bible, it's page 668. Proverbs 31 verse 25. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. There's just a snapshot of Ruth, this noble woman. Ladies, let me do the most bold thing I've ever done and just speak to you for a moment. Men, you can keep your ears shut for a moment. Ladies, do you desire godliness? Do you desire to be a noble woman? Would you spend some time this afternoon reading Proverbs 31 and pray, Lord, help me to be this godly lady? Is godliness a concern for you, ladies? Okay, men, you can wake up again. Let's come to Boaz. We want to imitate Ruth, but we want to imitate Boaz as well. And Boaz is a picture of sacrificial kindness. Sacrificial kindness. In the days of the judges, where everyone looked after number one, Boaz didn't. He was a man who always did what was right in God's eyes. So he didn't take advantage of this lady on the threshing floor. Many other men could have done, but Boaz didn't. In chapter 3 and verse 14, we see that he honours Ruth. In chapter 3 verse 13, we see that he honours the nameless Redeemer. How easy it would have been for him to kind of ignore that fact and kind of, sort him out on the sly. But he even says to Ruth, look, I'll sort it, but you need to know the facts here. And we see that Boaz is a generous man. From the time we're introduced to him there in chapter 2, he brings Ruth into the fold. He tells his harvesters to deliberately leave extras on the floor for Ruth to pick up, to take home to provide for Naomi. And of course, in his redeeming of Ruth and Naomi, he's willing to sacrifice his own bank balance. He's willing to live sacrificially to grow God's kingdom. Ladies, you can switch off for a minute. Men, do we desire godliness? If we desire to be godly, we will live sacrificial lives of kindness. We will live sacrificially with our bank accounts. We won't give the bare minimum to God and keep the rest for ourselves. We'll give whatever we can to the work of the gospel and keep the minimum for ourselves. Boaz was known as a man of standing, a man of honour. Man, is that something that we desire? While the women are reading Proverbs 31 this afternoon, men, I want us to reread the book of Ruth and just highlight everything we see about Boaz and go, Lord, please make me a godly man like Boaz. Okay, ladies, you can wake up again, and let's finally look at Naomi, and I want this to be both for men and women, because Naomi demonstrates that beautiful balance of faith in action. Faith in action. Naomi's daring ways, her methods to get a husband for Ruth, aren't going to make it in their way into any kind of marriage preparation courses anytime soon. You don't find, if you're into Joshua Harris, you don't find in any of the kind of the boy meets girl books anything like this. But there is still much to imitate. Because Naomi had a total confidence in the sovereignty of God, and that stimulated her to action. A total confidence in the sovereign kindness of God, which stimulated her to action. Look at chapter 1, verse 8 and verse 13. Naomi knows the kindness of God. Naomi knows the sovereignty of God. Even though she thinks the Lord is dealing bitterly with her, she knows that it's God who's doing it. There's not, I rely on God for the good stuff, but the devil's giving me the bad stuff. There's no warped thinking like that. She knows that God is the God of the good and the bad, but also his default habit is to bless, is to show kindness. And because of that, she acts in faith. She doesn't kind of go, well, I'll let go and let God. You know, I know his law says that he'll provide a redeemer for myself and for Ruth, and I'll just sit back and wait until it drops on my lap. She doesn't do that, does she? Her faith, the sovereignty of God doesn't stifle her faith, but stimulates her faith. She acts because God is sovereign. She doesn't know the outcome. She knows that Boaz has every right to say no. But that's the exciting life of faith, isn't it? We don't know what's going to happen when we step out in faith to build God's kingdom. But we know that he will build. And if we go, all right, it didn't work out, we go, that's okay. We acted under the guise of the sovereignty of God. Can I have the slide, please, Becky? Dietrich Bonhoeffer's, one of my heroes, was a Christian during World War II in Germany. And he knew a thing or two about living by faith, trusting in the sovereignty of God. And I found this quote of him this week. Being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin and more about courageously and actively doing God's will. Will that be us this week? Will we step out in faith, knowing that God will build his kingdom? Let me finish with a story. Can I have the next slide, please? This is Tony Bracefield, or a man affectionately known to us as Mr. B. He was one of our elders back in our church in New Zealand. He was a man who truly lived by faith, knowing that God was sovereignly going to build his kingdom. He had a job working as an accountant for one of New Zealand's biggest tourist firms called Explore NZ. You know, a salary probably in the £40,000-50,000 a year mark, which in New Zealand terms is really big. But he caught wind of a government proposal to really throw money at preschool education. You know, millions. And the government were happy for Christian trusts to apply for this funding as long as you could legitimately show that Christianity was a culturally suitable thing in the area where you're planning to build your preschool. We lived in South Auckland, which is a high Māori Pacifica area, and Christianity, albeit rather nominally, is part of their heritage. And so in faith he stepped out and set up a trust, the Manukau Christian Trust. And in faith he approached the government to build, for funding to build a preschool. They'd already acquired some land. That's the picture on the left. In fact, the land is next door to their house. And in God's goodness, he gave the trust $3 or $4 million, not just to build a preschool, because Mr. B stepped out in faith and said, well, actually, let's apply for more than we need, and we'll build it double story. Preschool upstairs, downstairs, a hall that we can use for church activities through the week. And it just so happens that our church was called Redeemer. Here is a man who stepped out in faith. His salary went down from 100,000 Kiwi dollars to about 30,000 Kiwi dollars. Because he lived knowing that God would build his kingdom. He knew that, and he knew that included people from South Auckland. He knew that included young people, and that young people could then take the gospel back to their families. He could see all that and stepped out in faith. Did he know the government were going to answer? No. But now, 12 years on from when that was taken, there's now 6 preschools, 6 Christian preschools across the city of Auckland, all bringing the gospel to young lives. If we've been redeemed by a greater than Boaz Saviour, and if we trust in his sovereignty to build his kingdom, what exciting places might your faith take you this week? Why don't you pick up your post-it note and just think for a moment, what's God saying to you? Where might be the places you step out in faith this week? Why don't you write it down and then maybe turn to the person next to you or behind you and just share that and encourage them. And then I'll pray in a minute.